What is up everyone, Jeremy here. In this video we're going to take a look at 4 quick tips to improve your snare drum. Alright, getting right to it, tip number 1, get some good samples. Samples are how nearly all major productions over the last couple decades have gotten those larger than life drum sounds. They allow you to add either small amounts of character all the way up to complete replacement. It's this versatility that has made them so popular. You're able to take a terrible drum track and make it sound incredible. Now let's have a look at some of my favorite samples and how I'm blending them to customize and improve my snare drums. Alright, so here we are in the DAW, and just real briefly I want to run through what all I'm using in these audio samples, so when you start hearing these play back you'll know what all you're hearing. And the first thing is, for the drums, I'm using the Get Good Drums Invasion library, which you can see on the screen. Because this video is specific to snare drums, I'll point out that I am using the Ludwig Black Beauty 14x6.5. So that is the snare drum that you will be hearing coming from Get Good Drums Invasion. From there, the additional samples that I'm using are from Bogren Digital. That's the first one, is the Jens Bogren signature drum samples. And I am using this in a somewhat unique way. So you have a direct sample and an ambient sample, at least with the Contact instrument. So I should point out I am using their Contact instrument that comes with the deluxe package. But with this, you can load it up in Contact. You can select which MIDI note you want it to trigger on. And I've done that so that this triggers on my snare drum from my drum track. But what I'm doing that's kind of unique here is I'm using a different sample for the direct mic and for the ambient or the room mic. And so what I'm doing is I'm using the ring job for the direct and the super nice for the ambient or the room. Just the way that I liked to do it. I liked the sound of each of these, specifically the super nice and the room sounds. So that's how I'm processing those samples, or how I'm using or blending those samples. And you can see the levels there. And then if we scroll all the way down to the bottom here, you'll see I also have another sample that I'm using, and I'll get to where these are being routed into the DAW in just a minute. But this is the Pearl snare that comes from the Middle Farms Studios samples. And I'll put links to all of these samples in the description below, so look for them there, and you can go right to the websites and read more about them and hear additional samples of these samples. But this is the Pearl snare. They also have a Brady snare, which sounds pretty good, but I found that what I was looking for in this little mix that I'm working on here, the Pearl snare was really what I was looking for, so that's what I went with. And something that's really, really nice about these Middle Farm Studio samples is you get a ton of different options with this. So you get a direct top mic, you get this SE 4400, which is kind of another top mic, just mic'd differently. A bottom mic, you get the overheads, you get near and far rooms, and then a compressed version as well. And you can obviously blend all of these to taste, and what's even nicer about all these is you can route each one individually how you want to route it. So I've got these first 3, which are all kind of direct, going straight to my snare sample that's routed into the DAW. Then I have the overhead routed into my overhead track, routed out to the DAW, and then the same for the room near and far, and the compress goes into the snare direct as well, and then I just blend it back a little bit. So that's ultimately the individual samples that I'm using. Alright, so let's go ahead and take a look at how I'm blending these individual samples here in the DAW. And as you'll see, I've got 4 different snare drum tracks, all routing into one snare bus. And just as an FYI, we are going to get to how I'm processing all of the individual snare sample tracks and the bus later in the video, so stick around for that. I'm not going to go into that just yet. This is just about the blending of the samples. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and just play back some of the overall drums so you can hear what this snare sounds like in the context of the drum mix and without the guitars and synths and bass and all of that. Then I will solo just the snare so you can hear that, the overall finished product. And then I will, as it's playing back, I will mute the individual samples so you can hear what difference it has on the final overall snare sound, if you will. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and play these drums back. All right, so that's a pretty simple beat. Let's go back to this section over here where there's a little bit more going on. God, it sounds so good. Okay, so here's what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna solo just the snare drum, and then I'm going to turn the individual snare tracks on and off so you can hear the difference that each makes. So have a listen. So there you go. That's a quick example of how these individual snare samples all blended together create this unique and massive sounding snare. It's got some good ring. It's got a good attack to it. It's got some good body and beef to it. And all of that comes from blending these individual samples together. You know, so this Jens Bogren sample is adding some of that like nice body and beef. We've got a great sounding ring from this Pearl snare from the Middle Farm Studios, and then the GGD snare is giving me a lot. It's giving me a little bit of extra ring, but it's mostly that like attack, that great stick attack that comes from this sample. So blending all of those together gives me this incredible sounding snare drum. All right, so continuing on with the tips, tip number 2 is transient control. Sometimes drum transients can be a bit too much and stick out pretty bad in a mix. There's a number of ways to solve this, like using different types of compression or limiting, but I personally prefer using a transient designer. Now let's go ahead and take a look at a couple transient designers that I use pretty frequently in my mixes. All right, so here we are. The first transient designer we're gonna take a look at is from Boz Digital Labs. It is called the Transgressor 2. I do have a video up on this on the channel. If you wanna go check it out, I'll put a link up here in the corner, and I will also put a link in the description to this product below, so you can go there and check it out and purchase it if you like it. Really quick, this is kind of just like as you would expect any other transient designer. You can adjust the level of the transient and the sustain, so you can dial back or up the transient, which is going to give you more or less attack, and dial up or back the sustain, which is going to give you more ring out or less ring out. And so because I found this GGD snare to be super, like there's a lot of attack, a lot of the transient coming through, I use this to dial it back and give me some more sustain so I can get a little bit more ring out of that snare. I'm also using this really handy feature here with it, where you have an EQ on just the transient and just the sustain, and you can see I'm taking off a little bit of that top end, the snap, if you will, of this transient. It's only affecting the transient, not the sustain. And so that's basically all that I'm doing in this Transgressor 2. And I want to give you, like I said, a quick A and B audio example before and after. So this is what it sounds like before. So you can really hear how there's like no sustain in that whatsoever. It's just all very, snap, right? So it's just a lot of the transient is basically all it is. So let me unbypass Transgressor 2 and have a listen to it now. So notice there's still enough, snap and transient and attack coming through there, but we now also have some additional ring out and sustain happening there. So it actually now sounds more like a snare and not just kind of like a cardboard box that you're hitting, right? So that is the power of a transient designer and how you can really improve the snare drum sound using one of these. And so the next one up that I want to show you quickly is the SPL Transient Designer from Plugin Alliance. Again, the link will be in the description below for you to go check this out. And I'm just doing basically the exact same thing here. And one thing that's nice about the SPL here is the simplicity of it. And it's literally mainly the only knobs you're really going to worry about most of the time is attack, sustain, and then the output gain. That's basically it. And so let me go ahead and I'll do a before and after here. And since you've already heard the before, I'll bypass this, play it for just a second, and then I'll turn it on so you can hear it. But have a listen. So it's very much the same as Transgressor 2. The thing that, like I mentioned before about Transgressor 2 that I really like is that the individual EQ on the transient and the sustain and being able to cut back some of that, snap on the top end of the transient. But this also does a fantastic job. And as you could hear, it pulled back the transient a bit and increased the sustain, which is what we're doing here with these dials, just to give us a little bit more ring. Again, it just makes it sound less boxy and more like an actual snare drum that actually has some sustain and some ring to it. So those are the Transient Designers. And continuing on, tip number 3 is the right processing. So all too often I have seen where folks who are just inexperienced with mixing, they slap on a ton of compression on the drums and think that's basically how you get that larger than life drum sound in your mixes. Just compress the hell out of everything. And that's not how it works. In fact, the opposite can be true as well, where knowing when not to process something is just as important as when to process something. So with all of this in mind, I want to go ahead and jump back into the DAW now and take a look at how I'm processing each of these individual sample tracks and my snare bus to make sure that it not only gives me the sound that I want, but that it's fitting in my mix. All right, so here we are back in the DAW, and what I'm going to quickly do is just run through the processing I'm doing on each of these sample tracks and then the snare bus. So taking a look at the Get Good Drums top snare mic, this is the Lindell 50 channel strip from Plugin Alliance. You don't necessarily have to use a channel strip, but I would recommend you look into getting one if you don't have one already. It just makes things a lot easier having everything in one place like this versus using individual EQs and compressors and noise gates and all of that. The main things that I'm using here on this snare are the EQ and some compression. And so what I'm doing here is I'm boosting around 100 hertz to add some more body and beef to the snare, and then cutting the frequencies that I've typically found in snare drums to have some of those like boxy sounds which just aren't pleasant. And so let me show you what I'm talking about here. So I'm going to play back this Get Good Drums top snare mic, and then I will turn on and off just the EQ in this, and you'll really hear those kind of like mid-range boxy frequencies really coming through strong when I turn this off. Have a listen. All right, so that is what I'm doing here. And so just quickly looking at it. So like I said, knowing when to process something and when not to is important. And you can see I'm not pulling back a ton or even boosting a ton on much of any of this. So the boxy frequencies that I've often found in snare drums are at around 500 hertz and 1500 hertz. And so those are the ones that you can see I'm pulling back. I'm pulling a bit more of the 500 hertz back because that's that lower mud boxiness that just I can't stand in snare drums. So I'm pulling back around 4 dB on that, and just a little bit less than 2 at 1.5K. I'm basically leaving everything else the same, like I said, boosting up 100 hertz there. And then we're adding a little bit of compression here. I think it's maybe like peaking at around -6 dB. And that's like the absolute hardest, kind of like rim shots. But that's just to kind of level things off, and then again just to kind of add a little bit more sustain. It kind of helps bring out some of that because we've got this super fast release, and then it's not a super slow attack. It's kind of just a little bit less than the slowest option here, but that's just to kind of dial back just a little bit of that transient as well. So that's the compression that we've got going on, and that's basically it across all of these. And so I'll just quickly pull up the rest of them. And you can see it's pretty much the exact same thing across all of these. At 1.5K and 500 and 100 hertz, you can see this is the GDD snare bottom. So I'm rolling off some of that 500 and 1.5K, boosting up around 100, and then actually rolling off a little bit of the top end around 12.5 and up. This is a top shelf. And that's just to kind of get rid of some of that top end fizziness from this bottom mic. Now taking a look at the Bogren ring job, what I'm doing here, and again, knowing when not to process something, right? As I said many times now, I can actually turn this EQ off because I'm not changing a thing. This thing sounded fantastic as it is, so there was no point in applying any EQ. I am applying a little bit of compression here, again, just to kind of try and get a little bit more ring out of this snare, and that's basically it on that one. Now, the Middle Farm Studios, very, very, very minor EQ happening here as well. Adding just a touch of top end, pulling back 1.5 and 500 hertz, as I mentioned before, but just, I mean, it's like maybe half a dB there, and then boosting up maybe 1 to 1.2-ish dB at 100 hertz. So just a very small amount of processing on the EQ, and again, just a little bit of compression to try and extend out some of that sustain to get a little bit more ring, and that's basically it. So that's the processing on the individual snare tracks. Now, looking at the bus, we're using Spiff, and I put this on my bus just to add an overall bottom end kind of beefy character to the snare. And sometimes I'll dial it up or back depending on the mix and how overall things sound. But I'll go ahead and just play this back real quick and then play it bypassed and enabled so you can hear the difference. But this is using Nolly's beefy snare preset here, so have a listen. Yeah, I just love what that does to that snare. You can hear how much like body and beef it kind of adds to the snare without getting, you know, too muddy or anything like that. So I absolutely love this plugin. Then we're going into the Brainworx BX Saturator V2. This is kind of dialed back a good bit. I will AB this so you can hear the difference. You're mainly going to hear this. This is actually set up in mid-side mode, so you can see the mid-high, mid-low, side-high, and side-low. And it's mainly on the side high where the majority of this saturation is happening. And it just kind of adds this crispy kind of snap to the overall snare. So let me go ahead and play this back and bypass it so you can hear the difference. Yeah, so like I said, it's a bit of a subtle thing, but you can clearly hear a little bit more snap when I activate it. So that's why I like using that on the bus, just to kind of process the overall snare. And not much happening here on this Pro Q. Just cutting some of the super high frequencies here up above 17K. As I found some of these it was just a little bit of a sizzle happening up there. So that's basically it. You probably won't even hear much of anything, but I'll go ahead and play it back and we'll bypass and see what we hear. See, as I mentioned, you can't really hear much there. It's just to kind of get rid of some of those some of that super high-end fizziness. Again, that's part of mixing, is just making room for things, right? And obviously cymbals and all of that are going to be taking up a lot of those higher frequencies, so I didn't really necessarily need my snare doing that, so that's why that's there. So that is the individual processing on the snare tracks and the snare bus. All right, and so the fourth and final tip for this video: the rooms matter. So again, this is about getting that larger than life, massive, incredible snare drum tone that you've been looking for, and you're not going to get it without good room sounds and processing the rooms in the right way. So let's go ahead and jump into the DAW again and take a look at what I'm talking about. All right, so first of all, let's go ahead and I'm just gonna solo my rooms so you can hear what it sounds like. It sounds massive, it sounds wide, it sounds expansive, it sounds deep. That's what I'm talking about. That's what you're gonna have to have and know how to get if you want that larger than life drum sound. So why do the rooms matter so much? Why are they so important? And why, if there's only one thing in this entire video that you take away, it's how important rooms are to the overall drum sound and how to process them. It's because of this right here. Have a listen. Do you hear what I'm talking about? How when I mute those rooms, all of a sudden all the life and everything just falls out. It still sounds good because I've EQ'd and processed everything to sound good on an individual track by track basis and across my buses. But the lifeless, they just sound lifeless when you lose the rooms. You lose a lot of that sustain and the depth and the width to the overall drums. And so let's go ahead and take a look at what I'm doing here to process these. And the first thing I want to point out is, like I said in the very beginning in tip number 1, and that is getting some good samples and being able to send individual room samples to your room bus is also important for that cohesive sound, right? And so that's where you saw earlier where I had sent the individual Middle Farm Studios samples and the Jens Bogren samples to the rooms and the overheads as well, but we're going to focus on the rooms right now. And so all of that coming into our rooms, we then need to know how to process all of it. And so the biggest thing is knowing how to EQ it and how to compress it, because that's what's going to give you that sustain. And just as an example right here, I'm going to bypass the compressor and listen to the difference. So obviously the compressor there is making a huge difference in that sustain and giving us that depth, if you will. So I do have the Lindell 50 channel strip here. However, this is actually not doing anything. I could actually remove this. This I had here because I was playing around with the FET compressor to see what that sounded like. It sounded okay, but I preferred the Townhouse compressor, which we're going to look at right now. So this is the Brainworx BX Townhouse bus compressor, again from Plugin Alliance, and again the link will be in the description below if you want to go check out this plugin. But this is a fantastic compressor. I love how it adds character to the overall sound, and it almost is like it adds a bit of upper mid-range and top end on it as well, and this V gain adds some nice, like almost like a form of saturation, if you will, like old school tape saturation, and make it sound more analog. So the way that I compress my rooms is I crank up the attack to the fastest option I can, and the same for the release. And the why is that is because I don't care a bit about the transients in the room. I'm gonna get plenty of that from my other tracks. What I want is the sustain. As you heard it, I want that ring out. So we're gonna cut off transients by getting that fast attack, and then using a fast release means the compressor is going to release from any sort of compression and allow the natural volume to come through, which is gonna give us that sustain. And then the threshold, you dial the taste, right? So that's basically how it works. And then your makeup gain, as it compresses, you get a bunch of gain reduction, you're gonna use your makeup gain to bring back some of that volume. That's basically it. So I've already A/B'd the difference between what the compressor on and off, but we'll go ahead and do it one more time so you can hear it again. And you can see I'm getting some pretty good gain reduction here. I peaked at around maybe -13. So that is how I'm using the bus compressor there. And then the last thing, and this is gonna look crazy, is knowing how to EQ your rooms is also vital to getting that good overall room sound that's going to benefit the drums and not just add mud and fill up your mix with sound that you don't want. So let me go ahead and first A/B this before we start walking through this so you can hear exactly what all this is doing. All right, so now quickly running through the individual EQ moves that I'm making in this EQ on these rooms. And so the first thing is we're processing what we have a high pass here that is stereo placement on the sides. And that is because I don't mind leaving some of that lower end of the rooms in the middle where it should be. And in fact, I like having a roomy sounding kick drum in my mix. It helps bring it, again, adds that larger than life sound, adds some room and depth to it. But I wanted to cut some of that low end out of the side, so that's what I'm doing there. Boosting up at 184 hertz to add a little bit more of that fundamental frequency from the snare in there, just give it some more beef. And then we've got a few strategic cuts here that we're notching out from some of these resonant frequencies. And in fact, I'll go ahead and just solo this one here real quick so you can hear what it sounds like. You can hear that, you know, kind of whistly sound in there. It was really strong in the overall room, so I had to cut that out. Same with some of these other ones. Now this more general bell you can see that I'm dropping out here, this is again 475 hertz. It's near that 500 hertz range I was talking about before, where it just kind of adds some of that muddy, you know, lower mids in there, or the mid range in there. So just dropping some of that out. These two here are kind of a stereo width trick, where if you boost slightly, this is only like 1.7 dB, but if you boost a couple, you know, a different frequency on your left channel than on your right channel in this kind of upper mid-range high end, it just helps expand the overall width. And so I'll play these back real quick and turn them on and off so you can hear the difference. And so if you're on a good pair of headphones or a good listening environment, you'll hear how it just kind of brings up the one frequency over here and then over here, which just kind of helps expand the overall sound. And the last thing is a low pass, just to kind of cut out some of that super high end, you know, kind of fizziness that I didn't need from the rooms. The last thing I'll point out is you're seeing some of this noise coming from the compressor. This is from that V gain I was talking about, which adds that kind of tape saturation sound. That's all you're seeing there. That's what it is. So that is the overall drum room processing. So what I'll do now is play back the entire drum mix for you one more time, and then I'll turn on the full mix so you can hear it in context. As you can see, by utilizing these 4 tips, you'll be able to get that larger than life drum sound you've been looking for, and you'll be more well equipped to dial in some incredible sounding snare drums in your future mixes. If you liked these tips and found this video helpful, do me a favor and hit that like button down below, and consider subscribing to my channel for more like this in the future. With that, I want to thank you for watching, and thank you for your support.